Beth Shirley will be our presenter tonight. Beth is a registered pharmacist and a clinical nutritionist. Some of you who've been to our previous webinars will have heard some of the previous content we presented on the role of nitric oxide in immune function, sexual function, mental health, and we're continuing that series with a focus this month on hormones. So we were lucky enough to have Beth present some of this information at the recent IAACN conference, which is a clinical nutritionist focused conference in Dallas this weekend just gone by. And we are going to follow up that with a similar presentation here tonight. So Beth has been a pharmacist for 40 years with the specialties including stress-induced hormonal imbalance, intestinal dysfunction, autoimmune and chronic inflammatory issues, detoxification, and supernormal oxidative stress. Most relevant to tonight's topic, Beth has also been working in nitric oxide, the nitric oxide space for 11 years, and she is the executive director of our scientific advisory board. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Beth, and we will work through the information that she's prepared for us tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Going to talk about nitric oxide and hormones tonight. Aging is a loss of hormones. Aging is a loss of nitric oxide. And so why is nitric oxide essential? It regulates all cardiovascular function and homeostasis, circulation and microcirculation. Our red blood cells require adequate nitric oxide in order to deliver oxygen to the cells. Supports neurotransmitter function, regulates gastrointestinal function, including gastroparesis, the mucus lining, our first line of defense against pathogens, the circulation in order to absorb all these nutrients. Nitric oxide activates a GLUT4 receptor that translocates and brings insulin into the cell. Nitric oxide controls the efficiency of mitochondria in the generation of energy and in the generation of hormones. Nitric oxide is required for stem cell mobilization and differentiation. It tells the stem cells where to go and what to do, which is essential for all healing to take place. Nitric oxide regulates the immune system, regulates the inflammatory response and scavenges free radicals, modifies platelet activation and aggregation, and supports telomerase activity. This is the aging part. Okay, this is such a cool diagram, and it shows how nitric oxide regulates hormone production in the hypothalamus-pituitary, which goes on to regulate LH, FSH, which goes on to tell the ovaries and the testes to make hormones. And as you can see from this, there's two main hormones that uncouple NOS. It's your prolactin and your glucocorticoids. And we're going to talk about these coming up. Next one. So we've got two main pathways that we make nitric oxide. The first one is the arginine NOS pathway. It takes arginine and oxidizes it to nitric oxide, which further oxidizes it to the nitrate and nitrite. And then we've got the nitrate pathway. So you've got the nitrate and nitrite from the arginine pathway plus the dietary nitrates. They get swallowed, absorbed, transported around in the circulation, concentrated in the salivary glands. The salivary glands release the nitrate. We've got good anaerobic bacteria on the dorsal aspect of our tongue, which will reduce that nitrate to nitrite. We swallow the nitrite, and in the acidic environment of the stomach, some of that nitrite is reduced further to nitric oxide, but most of it gets absorbed. It acts like a reservoir for nitric oxide, and we have other nitrite reductases in tissue that will further reduce that nitrite to nitric oxide on an as-needed basis. Like we've got myoglobin in the muscles that will reduce the nitrite to nitric oxide. Hypoxia stimulates this pathway. Acidic environment will stimulate this pathway. The electron transport chain has nitrite reductases to make nitric oxide as needed. This is a cartoon of the NOS enzyme. So when NOS is coupled, it has a 5-electron transport from your NADPH to BH4 to arginine to nitric oxide. When it's uncoupled, that electron transport transfers that electron from oxygen and makes superoxide. So when NOS is uncoupled, it becomes a superoxide generating enzyme, not a nitric oxide generating enzyme. And many things uncouple that NOS. Oxidative stress, diabetes, lipid peroxidation, BH4 deficiency, phosphorylation status. So what goes into the decline in nitric oxide? As we age, this is a big one. But as you can see, as women, we hold on to our production of nitric oxide a little better than men till we hit menopause because of our estrogen production. So by the time we are 40, our ability to make nitric oxide through the NOS pathway decreases to about 50%. By the time we're 60, it decreases to about 15%. And this is why it is essential to support that nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway to optimize nitric oxide. So what are the factors affecting nitric oxide? Aging, we just talked about that. Diet, the standard American diet, devoid of nitrate-rich veggies. Exercise or the lack of. Exercise increases our production of nitric oxide. Medications, antibiotics, antidepressants, birth control pills, NSAIDs, PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. These inhibit the production of nitric oxide through both pathways. Pollution, anything that increases oxidative stress, will increase the uncoupling of NOS. Genetics, and I'm not just talking about the NOS SNPs, I'm talking about any SNP that increases oxidative stress. Any of the SOD SNPs, catalase SNPs, HFE SNPs, anything that affects the production of BH4, like your DHFR, QDPR. If you have any MTHFR SNPs, you're by definition nitric oxide deficient because you're unable to make your BH4. And the big one, stress. Stress increases cortisol, which uncouples NOS. So we'll first talk about sex hormones. Nitric oxide regulates the hormone release in the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. It triggers the pulsatile release of the LHRH, which mediates LH release. Then LH stimulates the production of your steroid hormones, your testosterone and your estradiol. Your estrogen stimulates your eNOS to produce nitric oxide, but it declines with age. So this will decline in nitric oxide production. It's so much, in fact, that 85% of the women in the US are hypertensive by the age of 85. Progesterone acts directly on the epithelial cells of the endometrium to stimulate expression of eNOS, increasing nitric oxide production. Testosterone deficiency induces endothelial dysfunction. Deficiency can lead to erectile dysfunction and or vascular dysfunction. Testosterone regulates the nitric oxide cyclic GMP pathway. This directly influences endothelial function and the endothelial progenitor cells. And these EPC cells, these are key for endothelial repair. ED is ED. Erectile dysfunction is endothelial dysfunction. So usually erectile dysfunction is one of our first signs of cardiovascular disease and affects 20% of all males, 30 to 50% of males between 40 and 70. And more than 60% of the men older than 70 report ED. Nitric oxide is a non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurotransmitter that innervates the corpus cavernosum. It plays a critical role in initiation of the intracavernous pressure and erection and activates soluble guanyl cyclase to increase cyclic GMP. The cyclic GMP regulates the activity of the calcium channels to relax the smooth muscles, and this allows the engorgement. The PDE5 inhibitors, like Viagra and Cialis, these prolong the action of the cyclic GMP to extend the erections. They do not cause the erections. You must have adequate nitric oxide in order to get the erection to begin with, and these PDE5 inhibitors allow that erection to stay around longer. This is not having enough nitric oxide is why they're not effective in almost 50% of the men treated. Testosterone has a dual action in the tissue. It modulates this nitric oxide cyclic GMP signaling mechanism by upregulating NOS expression, but it also modulates the phosphodiesterase activity in the tissue, regulating the erections. I caution on the use of aromatase inhibitors, your anastrozole, your letrozole. Those are used in a lot of compounded testosterone replacement prescriptions. And the DHT blockers, the 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, these are used for hair loss because both of these decrease the production of nitric oxide and increase the occurrence of ED and cardiovascular complications. In the female sexual arena, research shows that in the US, between 25 and 60% of the women experience some sort of sexual dysfunction. Female genital arousal response is all mediated by nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator of clitoral, labial, and vaginal tissue. It's a non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurotransmitter of the corpus cavernosum in the clitoris to relax smooth muscles, just like in males, to increase the blood flow and the ability to respond. Increased blood flow means better orgasms. Nitric oxide decreases anxiety, which increases sexual pleasure. Nitric oxide is that non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurotransmitter in the brain, modulates the release of oxytocin and LHRH. And both of these are central in the modulation of sexual behavior. Oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, the love hormone, increases nitric oxide through the eNOS pathway, and in turn, orgasms increase oxytocin, but you must have adequate nitric oxide to have the orgasm. Nitric oxide is involved in creation of long-term memory, and studies have shown that memory and libido are closely connected. It enhances the ability to remember sex hymns, the pheromones. Following sexual stimulation, nitric oxide modulates the release of 3 to 5 mL of vaginal transudate to enhance lubrication. So nitric oxide is essential in order for us women to be able to feel, to respond, and it's essential for lubrication. SSRIs inhibit eNOS, uncouple eNOS, decreasing nitric oxide production, and blocks arousal in both men and women. So this leads to problems with desire, arousal, ejaculation in men, and orgasm in both men and women. The adrenal glands. Stress initiates a fight, flight, freeze response, while all non-essential functions like sex drive, reproduction, and digestion are acutely diminished. The adrenals require adequate nitric oxide to work effectively, and the glucocorticoid production in the adrenal glands is increased in the absence of nitric oxide. Cortisol is the only hormone that naturally increases with age. It inhibits eNOS, thus the impaired immune response. People get sick easier. It inhibits eNOS, thus the cardiovascular complications you see with stress. Cortisol increases the reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria. Cortisol increases your NADPH oxidase, your NOx enzyme. Your NOx enzyme produces superoxide and hydrogen peroxide. That's the only thing it does. But see, when you're upregulating your NADPH oxidase, you're using up all this NADPH that is needed for the NOS enzyme. It's also needed for you to make your glutathione. Cortisol decreases the synthesis of BH4. This increases NOS uncoupling. When you increase NOS uncoupling, you're increasing the superoxide production, decreasing nitric oxide production. Cortisol decreases the membrane transport of L-arginine. So all of these decrease the production of and or make nitric oxide not bioavailable to do all these good things. DHEA is a prohormone which metabolizes into other estrogens and testosterone. It's synthesized in the adrenal cortex, the gonads, the adipose tissue, brain, and skin, and directly increases nitric oxide production by the activation of eNOS. Low levels of DHEA are associated with increased erectile dysfunction in men and lower sexual responsiveness in women. So growth hormone and IGF-1 stimulate eNOS. Adult hypopituitarism and untreated growth hormone deficiency is associated with endothelial dysfunction, decreased nitric oxide production, increased peripheral resistance, and increased cardiovascular mortality and morbidity. Oxytocin, the love hormone. This induces erection by increasing the NOS activity in the cell bodies of the oxytocinergic neurons. This projects to the extra hypothalamic brain areas and mediates how we respond. It's a cuddle hormone, the love hormone. Increased nitric oxide production through NOS, and levels are increased after orgasm. But remember, we need that nitric oxide in order to have the orgasm. Nitric oxide appears to slow or reverse the aging of eggs in mouse ovaries. Studies suggest that nitric oxide may help women in their 30s and 40s remain fertile longer and increase their chances of having healthy babies. That's pretty cool. In the metabolic system, nitric oxide regulates carbohydrate metabolism and insulin production. Nitric oxide is emerging as a central regulator of energy metabolism and body composition. Impairment of nitric oxide synthesis is a central defect causing metabolic abnormalities associated with insulin resistance. So insulin initially stimulates eNOS activity, increasing nitric oxide. However, insulin resistance decreases eNOS phosphorylation, which increases NOS uncoupling, causes loss of endothelial function, increased expression of vascular cell adhesion molecules and other adhesion molecules, increasing oxidative stress. Remember, when you increase oxidative stress, you increase NOS uncoupling. The GLUT4 receptor requires adequate nitric oxide in order to translocate and bring glucose into the cell. Hemoglobin A1C binds tightly with nitric oxide. This renders nitric oxide not bioavailable. The higher the A1C, the less nitric oxide available to keep the circulation and microcirculation healthy. So the NOS pathway is impaired with blood sugar dysregulations and oxidative stress in a way that the nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway is not. PCOS. PCOS is related to insulin resistance, diabetes, obesity, oxidative stress, inflammation, and cardiovascular disease. All of these conditions are mediated by nitric oxide. Remember what I said, increased oxidative stress increases NOS uncoupling, which increases even more oxidative stress. PCOS decreases Treg cells, which modulate the immune system, maintain tolerance to self-antigens, and prevent autoimmune disease. All of these are regulated by nitric oxide. PCOS increases ADMA, asymmetric dimethylarginine. This decreases arginine bioavailability. Plus, it competes with arginine in the NOS enzyme and uncouples that NOS. Plasma levels of ADMA predicts all causes of mortality. And the way they treat most of these women with PCOS is they give them birth control pills. Birth control pills further uncouple NOS, decreasing the production of nitric oxide, increasing oxidative stress, and this just leads them down into very unhealthy biochemistry. Thyroid, nitric oxide deficiency expressed as cold extremities. So that NADPH oxidase enzyme, an enzyme that produces superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, in the thyroid, the NADPH oxidase enzymes are called DUOX1 and DUOX2. But this DUOX1 and DUOX2, it needs precise amounts of hydrogen peroxide or thyroid peroxidase, the TPO enzyme, to work correctly. So when you've got increased DUOX activity along with decreased TPO activity, this really increases that oxidative stress. So there's many factors that upregulate that NOx, DUOX1, DUOX2. Environmental toxicities, big one, mold exposure, mast cell activation, stress, chronic infections, inflammation. All of these upregulate NOx and DUOX, which increase the reactive oxygen species. Oxidative stress downregulates the production of nitric oxide. So this is a really bad vicious cycle. The nitrites and nitric oxide inhibit NOx and DUOX. So supporting the nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway may be an underutilized thyroid therapy due to its role in decreasing the production of superoxide and other reactive oxygen species by optimizing nitric oxide levels, scavenging reactive oxygen species, and supporting healthy circulation and microcirculation. REM sleep plays a significant role in maintaining emotional well-being and psychological balance. Nitric oxide regulates the release of acetylcholine and consequently the occurrence of REM sleep. Regulation of REM sleep is an age-dependent process involving nitric oxide. When we lose the ability to produce adequate nitric oxide, sleep becomes disturbed. Reduced nitric oxide production contributes to age-associated impairment of clock gene expression. Basically, impairment of the nitric oxide production results in a phase shift of the circadian clock. When the circadian rhythmicity is impaired, a condition called non-dipper hypertension can occur, and this is pretty serious. So decreased nitric oxide from aging is linked to impaired circadian rhythm. And when people's hormones are unbalanced, many times you'll get mood disturbances, anxiety, depression, and nitric oxide may be involved in the regulation of anxiety-like behavior. Anxiety and depression are associated with low levels of BDNF. Nitric oxide mediates the neuroprotective actions of BDNF in promoting neuronal survival and stimulating the process of neurogenesis. Nitric oxide induces neurogenesis, enhances learning and memory, and plays a role in synaptic plasticity, which positively affects mood. Higher concentrations of nitric oxide in the brain suppresses the activity of GABA-T, GABA transaminase. By decreasing this, you actually increase the GABA concentration in the brain. So nitrates increase the production of BH4, which increase the production of all these neurotransmitters. Your serotonin, your dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, melatonin. Supporting the nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway decreases oxidative stress and inflammation. And we all know that oxidative stress and inflammation plays a huge role in biological dysfunction in every system. This is a great study, Mechanisms of the Protective Effects of Nitrate and Nitrite in Cardiovascular and Metabolic Diseases. It's this year. So the dietary nitrates reduced to nitrite, be further reduced to nitric oxide. This will decrease the reactive oxygen species, which further increase nitric oxide bioavailability. This decreases peroxynitrite production. This pathway does not utilize BH4, so it allows more BH4 to hang around so you can make your neurotransmitters. The nitrites also nitrosate thiols. Some of them can influence the complex 1 activity to decrease reactive oxygen species. They can also nitrosate glutathione. So there you've got a storage form of both nitric oxide and glutathione. So dietary nitrates decrease oxidative stress through multiple pathways. Okay, in summary, nitric oxide production naturally declines with age, reducing to about 50% by the time we're 40, and by as little as 15% by the time we're 60. Nitric oxide and hormones are intricately entwined to keep circulation and microcirculation healthy, keep the cells and tissues supplied with oxygen, glucose, and nutrients, carry away the cellular debris, and keep those cells healthy. Supporting the nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway not only increases nitric oxide directly, it helps recouple eNOS to increase nitric oxide through that pathway, decreasing oxidative stress. Aging is a loss of hormones. Aging is a loss of nitric oxide. So if you guys want to read more about the eNOS uncoupling, I have a paper where I go more in depth to that, and we'll be glad to send that out to you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Beth. And as Beth mentioned, we will share that with anyone that attended tomorrow in an email. And we also have physical copies available. So if anyone was interested in that, we can also send those to you directly. So we did have a number of questions that came through during the call. So I'll go just in chronological order as they came through. The first was, can Beth elaborate why birth control pills reduce nitric oxides, since she also said that women tend to have nitric oxide production for longer than men?
Well, birth control pills they stop the production of all hormones in a woman's body. And remember, I showed you that all these hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, DHEA, testosterone, all of these stimulate eNOS to make nitric oxide. But the birth control pills outright are a quote unquote toxin that increases oxidative stress that will uncouple NOS. So birth control pills are not bioidentical hormones. They do not act like hormones, like our own hormones in our bodies.
Got it. And from the same person as B. Gibson, are there studies about prostate flow and nitric oxide?
I haven't gone down that path yet to really check into it, but by increasing the delivery of oxygen, glucose, and nutrients to these cells and being able to carry away the debris, hopefully that will help that tissue better stay healthy. But I don't know for sure. I have not checked into that.
Okay. Another question here is, can estriol E3 work the same as estradiol E2 in stimulating eNOS?
Yes. Yes. All our hormones, they can positively affect eNOS on increasing nitric oxide, except for the cortisol and the prolactin.
And on that topic then, do you know if it is seeing as it can, do you know what the minimum dose that can be used for that effect?
I do not know.
Okay. So this is another question, and it's assume you have some kind of assessment if your NO is at some kind of level.
Right. Berkeley Life has a nitric oxide test strip. This test strip will test, it's a saliva test. It will test your ability to reduce that nitrate to nitrite. It will test the nitrite in your saliva. So nitrite is our storage form of nitric oxide. And we have 3 clinical studies where we have correlated the nitrite concentration with the ability to decrease blood pressure.
I think that also answers another question similar to it. So since nitric oxide decreases with age and hormones do also, how do you increase NO where there is no other root cause other than aging? So I think that
there's lots of other causes besides aging. I mean, even if we're eating organic, we're still getting glyphosate. Glyphosate will uncouple NOS. There's thinking that glyphosate fits wherever there's a glycine in a molecule. The NOS enzyme actually has 2 glycine molecules. So you're fitting glycine, and the NOS enzyme will uncouple NOS. Plus glyphosate interferes with your flavins. And on that NOS diagram I showed you, you will see you've got the FMN and the FAD. So if you're destroying that FMN and FAD with glyphosate, you're not handing down the electrons correctly. So even if you're eating organically, they're showing that organic food even has a glyphosate. It's in the air, it's everywhere now. So there's lots of reasons for that NOS to uncouple, especially now. But supporting the nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway will increase our production of nitric oxide, but it also goes back around and helps recouple that NOS. It increases the production of BH4 to help recouple that NOS. So when you recouple NOS, you're decreasing the production of superoxide. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we've covered in a lot of detail. Is the person who asked the question, I can send it to you after the call, but we've done other videos or webinars where we've gone into a lot more detail into specific causes of eNOS uncoupling and reductions in nitric oxide. So I've highlighted your question here, and I'll follow up with an email afterwards to direct you to some of those videos. So 2 questions that came in that I've also received in the last few days is, does bioidentical hormone supplementation or therapy stimulate nitric oxide?
Yes, it does. So that's why, like, hormones keep us juicy, but we need nitric oxide to help make that juice too. So they work together. But yes, bioidentical hormones will stimulate NOS production as long as NOS is coupled.
And the same question then is, similar question is, does oxytocin supplementation increase NO globally?
Yes, yes. It stimulates eNOS as long as eNOS is coupled. But with the nitrate supplementation, you can actually help couple that. So you can optimize your nitric oxide through both pathways.
And we'll do two more. So is there a negative effect in using estrogel, if you're familiar with that?
Not if you need it. I'm not really thrilled with the base, but estrogen is pretty important for keeping us lubricated and juicy. You know, I'm more of I'm a compounding pharmacist, so I'm more of like compounding the dosage and the right base particular to the person. So personalized supplementation.
Okay. And then the last one we'll do tonight is, being that nitric oxide is gas, what is the half-life of nitric oxide when using supplements producing NO?
Wait a minute. I don't know if I heard you, but see, the nitrates have a half-life of 6 to 8 hours. And nitrites have a half-life of about 20 minutes. But nitric oxide is only around for a couple seconds. So that's one of the beauties of supplementing with nitrates. You get a longer effect from it. And so with the Berkeley Life, I recommend 2 capsules in the morning, and then eat a high nitrate veggie at lunch and at dinner to help prolong the action of it. If you're using, like, if you're trying to get somebody off of blood pressure medications, I would usually use 2 capsules in the morning and 2 capsules in the evening. If you're supporting sexual health in men or women, 2 capsules in the morning and maybe another 2 capsules about an hour prior to activity. And you'll see response will increase.
Great. Okay, well, that was all the questions, and definitely if people feel that, you know, other questions come to mind over the next day or two that they would like to send across for Beth to review, then please feel free to do so. Our contact information, I'll just share it here. And I'll be sending around a video of this to everyone that joined the call and anyone that registered for the call also. There definitely was some queries about you know, nitrate supplementation and testing. So if you're ready to start recommending some nitric oxide supplements, then we obviously have a line of supplements called Berkeley Life Professional. If you want to just start testing your patients for nitric oxide, we also have some nitric oxide test strips that we can get you started with. We like to give those to practitioners so they can just test them out first if they're uncertain whether they want to move forward or not. So Donna's information is there. Donna is our account support specialist, and she'll be happy to take your call or respond to your email. As I said, all this information will be available to you in an email tomorrow, but we'll have it all available in physical form as well if you want to read that nitric oxide and hormone piece that Beth recently completed.
Yeah, and you guys, you know, if you've got any questions, just, you know, feel free to let us know. I'll be glad to answer.
And also in the email tomorrow will be a link to our Facebook forum where Beth regularly posts some of the latest research in the area of nitric oxide. So if you're interested in this topic, definitely recommend that you join that Facebook forum and post some questions there. Is certainly encouraged too. So thank you all for joining with great turnout tonight, which is fantastic. And thank you, Beth, as always, for the fantastic information. And looking forward to our next topic, which is to be determined, but some more information on the way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.